Over the last probably 5 to 10 years, we've focused our research efforts on making new antibodies for use in Alzheimer's disease, or potential use in Alzheimer's disease. And so that's driven the research over the last 5 or 10 years in the hope and belief that that dementia and Alzheimer's testing would become an important part of the blood testing landscape in the future, and we're starting to see that happen.
Hi, I'm Victoria Stevens, and welcome to this podcast, Stock Exchanges. In my day job working as a fund manager at Liontrust, investing on behalf of our clients in UK stock market listed companies, I'm fortunate enough to cross paths with some of Britain's most inspiring entrepreneurs. It's a huge privilege to sit across the table from the people who've put their heart and soul into growing and running companies. And in this series, I want to share that privilege with you, our viewers and listeners. Today, I'm welcoming into the hot seat Peter Harrison, the Chief Executive of Bioventix PLC. Now, when you hear people talk about unearthing hidden gems in the micro and small cap part of the stock market, Bioventix is exactly the kind of company that comes to mind. Founded in 2003, Bioventix is a biotechnology business involved in the creation and supply of sheep monoclonal antibodies, or SMAs. These antibodies are sold to medical diagnostics or research companies for incorporation into diagnostic assays used to test for the presence and concentration of biomarkers in the blood. Tests using Bioventix's antibodies are used in a wide variety of end use cases, from detecting vitamin deficiencies and hormone imbalances, diagnosing acute events like heart attacks and monitoring exposure to pollution, as well as helping to research and develop assays for the early detection of Alzheimer's disease, one of the biggest health challenges of our time. And all of this comes in spite of Bioventix's small size. It employs just 17 people at its Farnham laboratory headquarters in Surrey, and it's capitalised at less than £100 million at the time of recording. Peter's led the business as chief executive since he led a management buyout to create Bioventix over 2 decades ago, and he owns almost 6% of the equity of the company. Thank you so much for joining me today, Peter.
It's great to be here, Victoria.
So I hope we can start with a bit of a life story, if you don't mind, and take you back. Your biography says that you spent over 4 decades working in the industry. How did you get into it in the first place?
Well, I was lucky enough to be very good at exams, and that got me to Cambridge University, where I studied chemistry. After I left Cambridge, I got a job working for Shell Chemicals, marketing petrochemicals. And I spent 5 years doing that before it dawned on me that my love of science ought to take me in a different direction. And in the mid-'80s, I connected with what was then the only biotechnology company at the time, called Celtech in Slough. So I spent 5 or 6 years working at Celtech in Slough, learning about antibody technology and business development within biotechnology. And then I left in the 90s to set up the Farnham laboratory, creating and manufacturing sheep monoclonal antibodies. Initially, in the 90s, it was for therapeutic purposes under the banner of a company called Biomedics, which subsequently went under. And I did a management buyout in 2003, redirecting the company's technology from therapeutic antibodies, which was a nice idea but didn't work, to using the same antibody technology towards finding niches within in vitro diagnostic testing. And that was the birth of Bioventix in 2003.
And the management buyout that you referenced there, Peter, I wonder if you can give us a bit of colour just on how did that come about and who was alongside you on that journey? Who backed you? How did that initial step for Bioventix take place?
Well, it all started in 2003 when the company at the time, Biomedics, was running out of money for its therapeutic product development activities. And it got bought by another failing company in Slough called Zenova. And that resulted with 2 failing companies being combined as one large failing company, resulted in the lab closing down and being liquidated in 2003. And that was the point at which I kind of considered my options. And at the time, I knew very little other than antibody technology, and so looking to do some kind of management buyout seemed like an appropriate thing to do. And I took some straw polls from 1 or 2 people I knew in the diagnostics industry industry as to whether there was merit or some future potential in Bioventix and its focus on diagnostic antibodies, and there seemed to be a whiff of support from people I knew in the outside industry in diagnostics, and that encouraged me to pursue the management buyout, and I did that with some private money from Malaysia.
Right, and the Malaysian money, was that a private equity backer that you had there, or was it more private individual?
It was a private equity group which knew a little bit about the technology, and so that was very helpful in springboarding the company. And the buyout was done with something like just over £1 million, a lot of which was actually used to buy the freehold of the laboratory. So the actual lab and its equipment was only valued at £700,000 or £800,000.
Right, and that lab presumably is the same laboratory where you still base yourself today.
It is exactly the same lab, albeit with slightly modified equipment and a lick of paint.
Yes, I'm sure. And so you've completed the management buyout. You're on the journey as an independent company. You made the decision, it was probably 5 or 6 years later, correct me if I'm wrong there, to list the company on what was then Plus Markets, wasn't it? Which has gone through multiple iterations since that point, but is in its newest guise is the Aquis Stock Exchange. But it's a market which is one stage earlier, if you like, than the AIM market, which is where you're listed now, and we'll come to the AIM listing in a minute. Can you tell me about why you decided to list on Plus Markets in the first place? That
was largely driven by the Malaysian private equity investor who had a desire to liquidate their fund and either sell companies or at least establish a defined valuation for them. And so that drove the initiative to list on Plus Market with a view to getting a bona fide evaluation which they could use as part of their wrap-up calculations for the maturation of their fund.
And then there came a natural next step as the company grew and evolved and became bigger in scale to take that next step onto the alternative investment market, and that was in 2014. How was the experience different on AIM?
Well, the initiative to list on AIM was driven by some of the existing shareholders that FinCap had introduced us to at the time. They had a desire for a greater degree of liquidity and they foresaw potential growth in Bioventix, and therefore it seemed appropriate to consider an AIM listing for a company of our potential journey. And so that was the rationale for getting onto the AIM market, and it was a journey which was complicated by lawyers and the procedure of getting onto AIM, and that was naturally quite resource draining. But ultimately, I think it was an important part of our journey.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because a lot of companies, when they talk about a decision to list on the market, might reference raising capital for growth, raising capital for either organic growth purposes or for acquisitions. Now, we will definitely come on to this in a minute, but your journey has been self-funded. You've been an organic growth story, so that clearly isn't a primary consideration for you in listing. It sounds like it's been a lot more driven by shareholders' requirements for liquidity. But I wondered if there was also, given that you deal with some of the largest diagnostics companies globally, whether there's also something of a badge of honour, a degree of transparency and trust that comes with a stock market listing that was helpful within the business?
Yeah, as you rightly say, the stock market listing wasn't to do with fundraising because after the management buyout happened in 2003, we were loss-making for the first 3 or 4 years, but by the time we got to 2006, 2007, we were generating cash and started to generate increasing volumes of cash. So certainly the listing wasn't to do with that. As far as credibility was concerned, I think certainly for newer shareholders, it made a big difference us being on AIM, and I think it was a big bonus for FinCap and then later Cavendish to have us on that market to help broaden the shareholder base. So it was important from that perspective. Our customers judge us largely by the products that we make, and so I'm not sure if the listing really affected them too much. It's more about the continual supply of antibodies, the quality of the ones we manufacture that are used routinely, and the pipeline for future products. We're more judged by that than anything else.
And that leads us neatly, I think, into discussing the company's raison d'etre in the first place, the manufacture and supply of these sheep monoclonal antibodies. Now, I think many of our listeners will understand very well what an antibody is and what it's been used for at a high level. But that sheep monoclonal part of the SMA moniker, I wonder if you can start us off by just explaining what sheep monoclonal antibodies are, why they're important, why their high precision and high affinity is an important attribute when it comes to the company's competitive advantage.
I think hormone testing is a great place to start. Everybody, all of your listeners will have heard of testosterone and know that testosterone is an important hormone as part of human biology, male and female. And the way that blood testing machines work, if you were to submit a patient sample for a testosterone hormone test, is that in a hospital pathology lab, there would be a machine manufactured by a large multinational such as Siemens or Roche. And that machine would conduct the blood test all in an automated way. And the robotic devices on those machines use antibodies as part of the detection technology. And so, for example, a blood sample that's being tested for its testosterone hormone levels, in the reagent pack in the machine, there will be an antibody to testosterone. And when the robot mixes the blood with the reagent, the antibody reagent, a binding event takes place between the anti-testosterone antibody and the testosterone in the blood sample, and that binding event is detected and measured by the blood testing machine. Now, when you submit a blood sample for testing at your local hospital or clinic, you automatically assume that the results are perfect. But in real life, it's not actually quite like that. And for example, with testosterone testing in 2003, 2004, a lady in Paris lined up a whole array of blood testing machines, and she subjected a whole array of blood samples from her fertility clinic to all the blood testing machines, and also sent a sample to the French government reference lab. And what she found was quite intriguing insofar as the testosterone tests on the machines for male samples all agreed with each other, and they were all correct as measured by the government reference standard. Whereas the testosterone levels in menopausal women and children, which are around tenfold lower, all the machines disagreed with each other, and they all disagreed with the French government reference lab, which meant that the testosterone tests that were being run on the machines for menopausal women and for children whose puberty had not yet emerged, the results were about the same as guessing the number. And at that point, it became clear that the test needed to be withdrawn for use from those patient groups. And that spurned a desire for better antibodies to solve that particular problem. And Bioventix was instrumental in helping with that. And even now, 20 years on, many blood tests around the world use our antibodies.
And if I'm right, the standard for manufacturing antibodies is to actually use mice, rodents, whereas for you, your route uses sheep. Is there a reason why sheep monoclonal antibodies are particularly higher affinity?
You're absolutely right that mouse monoclonal antibodies were discovered in Cambridge in the mid-1970s and became commonplace in the 80s. And mouse antibodies are generally quite good. We pursued sheep and a parallel technology to immunise sheep and then take out sheep white blood cells to make the monoclonal antibodies by growing them, on the hypothesis that sheep, because they're larger and live longer and they're more wild-type animals, will produce better antibodies. There was already some evidence from sheep blood to suggest that was the case. But then harnessing that response with monoclonal antibodies grown in fermenters using cloned cultures gave us an extra advantage. And we've established that quite clearly in our own lab, and our customers, I think, are now of the view that we did make good antibodies in that era during the 2005, 2015, and we still make great antibodies now.
Yes, that's really fascinating. And can you talk to us a little bit as well about the business model, what you're selling to customers and how they pay you? Because one of the advantages, of course, of your business model is that even if the revenue that comes from these blood testing machines isn't guaranteed contractually recurring, these are tests that typically are being used day in, day out in healthcare settings. And so they are of a very high degree of repeatability, which gives a really nice predictability and stability for your business model.
Yeah, and the way that works is that the antibodies are very, very special molecules. They're very individual. And the antibodies that are used on blood testing machines are instrumental in directing the performance of the tests. So the testosterone tests that failed, they were failing because the antibodies weren't quite good enough. So if you can replace that with an antibody that does improve the test, which we were able to do, and it led to tests which could be used on menopausal women and on prepubescent children. The ability to transform a test from something which is barely useful to something which is globally useful is a very, very valuable thing to do. And I took the view in the management buyout that if we had the ability with our antibodies to transform tests from tests which were average or not usable to tests which were valuable and usable, just because of the antibody, then that there was a certain, in my view, shared success model that I thought was appropriate, and we crystallise that in the form of royalties with our customers, such that we might sell physical antibody, which looks like physical water, but it's got antibody contained in it. And so we sell physical antibody, which accounts for around a quarter of our annual revenues, but 3/4 of our revenue comes from a downstream chargeable event, which happens when our customers sell kits for testosterone tests that use our antibody. They subsequently pay a royalty on that downstream transaction, and that makes Bioventix a very profitable business. And together with the fact that there's a natural reluctance to change an antibody on a test because it's so crucial to the performance of the test, that does lead to long-term use of antibodies, and therefore, from our point of view, a high level of revenue continuity.
I've heard you talk frequently in the past about how the research that's being done today is going to not drive revenues for the company next year or the year after, but many years into the future. So you have to have this very long-term view on value creation at the business. Can you explain for our listeners' benefits a little bit more about R&D and how the layering of different applications over time of the antibodies creates value?
Well, blood testing generally moves very, very slowly. So there are very rarely unique opportunities for blood testing. The coronavirus pandemic being an obvious exception, where suddenly there was an immense demand for one product. Then, of course, it subsided. But in terms of routine blood testing for fertility, thyroid hormones, cancer, heart disease, things move very slowly in those blood testing areas. And it's very seldom do new opportunities arrive. Over the last probably 5 to 10 years, we've focused our research efforts on making new antibodies for use in Alzheimer's disease, or potential use in Alzheimer's disease. And so that's driven the research over the last 5 or 10 years in the hope and belief that that dementia and Alzheimer's testing would become an important part of the blood testing landscape in the future, and we're starting to see that happen.
You absolutely are, and don't worry, we're going to definitely get into that later on in the podcast. But I think that real sense of discipline on capital allocation is really interesting, because of course, I mean, listeners won't necessarily know this, but you are an exceptionally high margin business. I mean, the last financial year was 77% profit before tax margin. So one of, if not the highest margin businesses in our stable of investments. But that is partly because, you know, as you've said to me many times, you know, you don't want to be a busy fool in terms of spraying money at research and development that won't yield you the return that you need it to show in the future, but to save your bullets, if you like, save them for those opportunities where there is a real clear unmet need for a higher sensitivity test and therefore antibody to be used.
Yeah, the way that works in practice is that occasionally things come along that are extremely valuable, and such as the heart disease biomarkers that we've worked on, and vitamin D would be another example of something that had immense commercial potential. And so the way that we manage the lab resource around those times when something of high value comes along is that we become totally focused on one particular biomarker. And so vitamin D was a case in point where all of the lab was focused on vitamin D for around 2 years, and we did nothing else because it was clear, well, it seemed clear to me at the time that vitamin D would be an important target for us. It suited our technology, and the vitamin D testing would be valuable and would be a long-term value generator, and that turned out to be the case. Therefore, it's appropriate that the entire lab was dedicated to vitamin D for a long period of time. Now, high-value diagnostics, as I mentioned earlier, don't come along all the time, and so it's like London buses. And so whilst you're waiting for the next London bus, it's kind of difficult to downscale by firing people and then trying to rehire them when the next bus comes along. So it is then incumbent on one to try and find things of finite value that might not be quite as high value as the heart disease or vitamin D projects that we've worked on. And so we try and fill the time in between high value targets to keep the scoreboard ticking over, as cricket followers might say.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned there about putting your valued and employees to work. It's a very small company by dint of the number of employees working for it. 17, I think, is the latest number. Does that give the lab a family feel? Is there a high degree of kind of camaraderie, loyalty, long-term relationships and culture that comes from being such a tight-knit team?
Obviously, I'm speaking for the rest of the team, but I sense that there is a cohesion amongst the team. We are very, very careful about recruitment. And I think because of that, we have a very high degree of staff retention, and people very rarely leave the company. And that's great from the point of view of resource, because very little resource is spent on recruitment and training of new people, because we have a lot of people who've been doing similar jobs for many years, and their know-how accumulates. And that's, I think, a great advantage for the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you must have people who are very, very long tenured there, almost as long as yourself.
We recruited 2 new graduates, and that was 8 years ago. And we've recruited our most recent new graduate in October last year.
Wow.
And we've had one graduate retire last year, and that's the sum total of staff movements over the last few years.
I mean, in many ways, some of the attributes, some of the mentalities that you've been describing remind me very much of how you might expect a smaller private business to be run. Do you try and think about the business from the lens of a private business, an owner-managed business, even though you're listed on the stock market? I mean, you own 6% of the company, but it's not like, you've got over half of the equity today. Do you still try and instill that owner-manager mentality throughout everything you do as a company?
I think a small team of people is very much like a sports team. I view it in terms of recruitment and in doing what one can to encourage a team spirit, an effective team spirit, such that people work together effectively and creatively and supportively for each other.
That is the intangible asset of culture right there. Now I'm going to move on now to talk about the most exciting opportunity that lies ahead of Bioventix today. And that is, as I said in my introduction, the research or helping to contribute to the research efforts to more accurately detect the presence of Alzheimer's disease in patients at an earlier stage of disease. So I wonder whether, to start with, you could explain the research and development you're currently involved in for Alzheimer's.
Well, let's return to the blood testing machines that we help support with our antibodies. If you look at the testing menus on the blood testing machines, they are able to provide information on almost every organ in your body. If you start with your neck down, consider your thyroid function, heart function, liver function, kidney function, reproductive organs, blood, and bone marrow. The blood testing machines have an array of tests which cover all of those organs. There is one obvious exception to the menus of all blood testing machines right now, which is your brain. There are currently no commercially available blood tests that are operated on high volume testing machines. And that's clearly a noteworthy exception, because your brain is arguably your most important organ. What's changing, and what's changing very rapidly, is the perceived availability of blood tests that can do just that, which is inform on the health, current and future health of your brain. And this transformation is coming about through a number of areas of scientific development. The first of which is a much better understanding of the processes within the brain which result in brain death, which might come about through various dementias such as Alzheimer's. There are a number of diseases of the brain. They all result in the death of brain cells. And when brain cells die, they die for particular biochemical reasons. And when they shed their breakdown products into the brain fluid, there are telltale signs of the disease processes that have taken place that have led to their death. So there's an increasing awareness amongst researchers, such as our friends at the University of Gothenburg, who help us immensely in our research. There's an increasing awareness of why brain cells die in different diseases and what breakdown products you might look for in the cerebral spinal fluid and blood of those patients to understand and get proof as to why those brain cells have died. So understanding the breakdown products of brain cell disease is important. Knowing what to look for is clearly important. And then the two other pieces of the jigsaw are testing or detection technology on the blood testing machines that can detect very, very low levels of these breakdown products, and of course antibodies, which is where we come in. And so there's a perceived future on the part of pretty much everybody in neurology, from the clinicians and the blood testing companies, that there will be a menu of brain health tests which will tell you where your brain is on your journey through life, where you are now and where you'll be in 5, 10 and 15 years' time. And so this transformation is happening right now in research labs around the world. And they're being embraced by our customers, who are the big blood testing machine companies.
So this isn't just about diagnostics, this is about prognostics.
A lot of the trigger for this comes from an awareness that Alzheimer's disease, which is clear to everybody, any of your listeners who will have friends or relatives with Alzheimer's disease, it becomes clear when they are symptomatic, because they are very forgetful and often they're disorientated, often don't really quite know where they are, whether they're in their own house or somewhere else. And I've seen that with relatives as well. But the thing to have in mind is that at that point where people become symptomatic, a very large amount of brain mass has been lost. And so people at that stage are much too late to consider lifestyle changes, financial planning changes, therapeutic intervention that might be possible. And that the time at which that is possible is around 10 years prior to people becoming symptomatic. So 10 years prior to people being symptomatic, clearly they appear as normal as you or I, but the pathological processes that are starting the Alzheimer's process will have started. And they will be on that unfortunate journey towards Alzheimer's disease. And it does take 10 years before that happens. But the telltale signs through the blood tests are clear 10 years prior to symptom onset. The other exciting thing that's kind of helped trigger the process amongst our customers is the emergence of therapeutic products. So these aren't lifestyle changes. These are drugs which will change human disease biology and will change patient outcomes with Alzheimer's disease. And
so that was a couple of years ago, wasn't it? To end of 2022, beginning of 2023, when effectively for the first time ever it was demonstrated that certain drugs could start to revert, even if it was that their efficacy is limited at present. There was evidence that they could not just slow the progression of the disease, but actually start to reverse some of its effects.
Certainly a transformational moment in 22-23 when clinical trial results from Biogen and Eli Lilly came out with their anti-amyloid drugs. When those phase 3 trials came out and demonstrated really clearly that those drugs were able to purge amyloid plaques from the brain, to cleanse people's brains, and also change the rate of decline of neurological loss. And after decades of failure in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, it really changed the perception that actually it was possible to change brain biology. It was possible to change future neurological function. And that was a breakthrough moment in 2022, 2023, and that's transformed the perception of pharmaceutical product development for Alzheimer's from what was previously a graveyard to what is now considered to be a great potential for human health on the part of patients, and clearly the pharma companies view it as being blockbuster territory financially. And that translates into, in our little world of blood testing, as a turbocharged interest in blood tests that help identify where people are on their Alzheimer's pathway, if they're not on it, if they're on it, and if they're on it, where they are on the pathway.
Because the earlier they are on it, the more efficacious such therapies are.
Everybody agrees in the industry that the patients must be identified early and around 10 years prior to becoming symptomatic for any drug to have any use.
I think it would be really interesting just to get a little bit into certain of those biomarkers, if you like, or byproducts that you were talking about earlier, and how they're directly relevant to what you and your customers are exploring from a research perspective. Both amyloid plaques, which you obviously referenced in your previous answer, and also tau.
People might have heard of amyloid plaque build-up in the brain, and people who perhaps read more deeply will have heard of tau tangle formation, which are two important disease elements of Alzheimer's disease. So amyloid build-up, tau tangle formation in the neurons of cells is important. And then the other obvious important element of Alzheimer's is the actual brain loss or loss of brain matter, and that's called neurodegeneration. So the field describes people on their Alzheimer's journey as the ATN framework, amyloid, tau, neurodegeneration, and that framework has been in place for many years now, and it's possible to identify where people are on that framework using brain scanners. So amyloid plaque buildup is possible to visualize using PET scanners with a tracer element which is injected into the blood and binds to the amyloid plaque, and that lights up on the PET scanner. Similarly, tau tangle formation, another element of pathology, it's possible to identify that, again using PET scanners with a different tracer that binds to the tau tangle formation. Then the other part of the equation, the amyloid, tau and neurodegeneration can be visualised post-mortem, but also on MRI scanners where you can detect holes and crevices in the brain where previously there was grey matter. So it is possible right now to, with the use of brain scanners, to tell where people are on their Alzheimer's journey. Brain scanners clearly are few and far between in all developed countries, and in this country perhaps more so than anywhere else. And also screening the population using brain scanners is not a practical means of activity, whereas screening people using blood tests clearly is, because they're cheaper and more widely available and can be done on a mass scale. And the process for collecting blood samples at phlebotomy centres and having them trafficked to robotic blood testing machines already happens on a routine basis. So the industry which we're part of is embarking on a process of establishing blood tests which mimic the results of those brain scans, such that they can either augment the results of the brain scans or replace the brain scans altogether. And it's progress with those ATN markers using blood tests that the industry is involved with and is making great progress. Bioventix is part of that process, and that's a very exciting part of our journey.
Absolutely, and it must be on a professional level just so fulfilling to be part of such a meaningful area of research into, as I said in my introduction, one of the greatest medical challenges of our time, and also one which touches all of us. So finding ways of solving that challenge, I can totally see how that is professionally very fulfilling, as I say, but also on a personal level. I just wondered, how does it feel to be part of something that is potentially going to be so meaningful for so many people's lives?
It's very exciting, and it's pleasing from a personal point of view because it's intellectually stimulating, which is valuable for me personally. But I think that's augmented by the knowledge that there is an outside world translation of our work, and it's pleasing to to witness that.
Absolutely. So I'm sad to say we're coming to the end of our time today together, Peter, on the podcast, but I wondered if I could ask you the final question that I've been asking all of our guests on the podcast, and that is that all of the people I speak to, including yourself, have been hugely successful from a professional point of view. But I always wonder what you would say if I gave you the opportunity to wind back time and spend, or indeed today, and spend just one day being any other person in any other career just for a day. Who would you exchange places with and why?
Could I be a fund manager at Liontrust?
You can if you'd like to.
If that wasn't possible, what I'd like to do is to employ my bioscience skills and fermentation skills in a small town called Harrow, which is in the Rioja region in northern Spain. And in particular, there's a bodega there called Ardanza, who make one of the finest products in the world. And I'd quite like a job there. The scenery's pretty good, the people are good, the countryside's beautiful, and the end product's not bad either.
Yeah, good socialising opportunities after work, I'm sure. And indeed during work. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for joining me today. That's been a really fascinating insight into all the research that you and Bioventix are conducting, especially in an area that carries so much weight for all of our lives going forward. And for our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for being here. And I really hope that if you liked this episode, you'll consider hitting follow or subscribe on the podcast platform that you use. As always, I must remind everybody that nothing in this podcast should be construed as investment advice or a solicitation to purchase securities or any investment product mentioned. We'll see you next time.